This video is brought to you by Taravangian. This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Taravangian is a character in the Stormlight Archive, a fantasy series by Brandon Sanderson. And Taravangian is written to be a smart character, a genius really, although it's a bit more complicated than that. And FYI, there's going to be zero spoilers for any Sanderson book plots in this video. You don't need to know anything. I will provide all the context spoiler-free. Okay, so the unique thing about this particular character in this particular fantasy world is that Taravangian wakes up every day with a random level of intelligence. And he is a king, and we see him doing all sorts of smart stuff on his smart days. He's making policies, he's coming up with whole political philosophies. He's got this thing called the diagram. It's like this incredibly intricate plan for all of humanity. And the way his royal attendants figure out how smart he is on a given day is this. They give him a math test. And that's it. That's how they determine whether he's King Solomon levels of genius or whether he has the intelligence of like a little child. A math test. A math test. Okay, I need to get this off my chest before we go further. Sanderson is an amazing writer. He is my go-to for I need something I know I'm going to enjoy, and I have learned a ton from him. His books, his lectures, writing excuses, interviews he's done. I've had discussions with him in person. I played Magic the Gathering against him. We are 1-on-1. I am a very, very big fan. And when I say he's an amazing writer, I'm not just saying like a blanket, like decent, solid, whatever. No, I want to make clear that I'm referencing specific things he is amazing at. The way he writes promises and payoffs, he is a master of momentum and plots. No one writes charisma like Sanderson. No one is even close to doing what he's doing with metaplot, and also his writing is just so clear to learn from. If you're watching this and you're not a Sanderson fan, you should become one. Go buy Mistborn or Skyward. I will link Amazon links to these books in the description because I need to make it very, very clear that I'm making this video about a pet peeve, about a single flaw that starts a really important discussion, I think teaches a really important lesson. This is not like a this is a bad writer video at all. Okay, so back to our Armenian math monarch. Yeah, okay, math test. Math test. So this really rubbed me the wrong way. I know when put in perspective of like the whole story, it's not the biggest thing and probably shouldn't bother me as much, but I could not get past it for the longest time. I was really stuck just being unable to respect this character as a whole, which sucked because it's a really interesting character, but it mattered that he was supposed to be not just smart, but a genius. And this didn't just make me not believe it, it made me mentally recoil. It was like midi-chlorians. It's undermining what we love about this quality of intelligence, that it does feel beautifully undefinable, it feels beyond our comprehension, it feels profoundly mysterious. But apparently no, it's what, factoring polynomials, it's multiplying matrices, is it big long story problems, is it the squiggly lines from Good Will Hunting? I basically had to push the whole thing out of my mind in order to move forward with the character. And first I thought the reason why this bothered me so much was everything we talked about in part 1 of this intelligence series. Intelligence is not this monolithic thing, there are types of intelligence. And Taravangian on his most genius days is being a genius statesman. How is math even the tiniest bit relevant to that? These types of intelligence have nothing to do with each other. In the real world, do we go to like the math departments in order to ask for political opinions? Can I go to my congressman and ask them to like take a math theorem? Like, of course this doesn't work. But the puzzling thing is that Sanderson even acknowledges this oversimplification in the story itself. In Words of Radiance, he says, the exact intelligence of a man is impossible to measure. Even your tests only give us an approximation. Speed at which you answer questions and the way you answer them, well, it lets us make a judgment, but it's a crude one. So it's odd that Sanderson even keeps it at all. I don't understand why he feels like it's necessary, as flawed as even he realizes it is, but also because there's a video of him talking about how to write intelligence that's really good. It's an excellent video. He's sitting there, he's hanging out with his chicken, he's signing stuff, and he says straight out,
I'm one of these people who kind of believes in a wide variety of types of intelligence and wisdom.
So I'm fairly confident that if someone asked him about this math test thing, he would say, yeah, it was something that I overlooked, I could have done that better. And yeah, sure, Sanderson writes really fast, he's juggling this like gigantic multi-book epic series, and sometimes stuff just falls through the cracks. Okay, fine. No, not fine. Where was the mistake? I know it sounds like we answered that question, but we answered why it's a bad thing, we answered why it doesn't work. What is the mistake? And I don't mean why did he make the mistake, we probably answered that too. He's writing fast, he's writing a lot, etc. But on a conceptual level, mistakes aren't random, they're not nothing. When he's saying, I'm gonna write it this way, and then in his hasty state he looks at it and he concludes, yeah, that's good. Forget Sanderson entirely for a second. What is in the mind of a person who is saying that? And I don't mean like, what is he thinking in like a disparaging rhetorical way. I'm asking honestly, can we work backwards and reconstruct the mindset that supports that way of thinking? Because again, mistakes are not random. This is something from my educational background, time for a little Aramaic lesson. So some of you know I do not come from academia at all. I studied Talmud in the Brisker Yeshiva for 6 years, and a vital part of Talmudic analysis is something called a hava amina, which is Aramaic for I would have said. Whenever a big statement is made, we're taught to not just define the final conclusion, but to ask, what's the hava amina? What is the mindset that produced the mistaken view that we're correcting from? If every time you make a mistake, you just write it off as, oops, just another random fluky thing that happened, and it's not part of a pattern at all, and we can't expect it to ever happen again, It's going to happen again. That mistaken mindset is still in your brain somewhere. Those patterns still operate. And it's because of those patterns, your havaminas are not entirely ridiculous. And as proof, you acted on it, so there must be something there. And until you lay it all out consciously, and you compare what you were thinking before to what you're thinking now, and you define each side of it clearly, then you haven't really finished understanding what you concluded. So defining a havamina means finding a logically reasonable but wrong view that you're operating on, you or someone else. And to reiterate, it is not psychoanalyzing, it is not asking why, it's asking what. What logically reasonable but erroneous view produces the mistake? That is different from asking what's inside the person's head. It's not asking what they were thinking. It can be used inductive reasoning to define premises or a model that they were operating under. What's the havamina is a question which is asked practically every day, multiple times a day in Talmudic analysis. Hugely useful question for advancing understanding in just about anything. Once you understand the havamina, you can take that and you can compare that to what we call the maskana, the conclusion, i.e. the truer conceptual position. And by looking at them side by side like this, by contrasting them, by finding the point of difference, by finding the point of disagreement between the two positions, you can arrive at a much deeper understanding of the conclusion. So that is what we're asking. What is Brandon Sanderson's havamina? Because Sanderson writes some incredible intelligent characters. Navani comes to mind. Her characterization is masterful, it's beautiful. There's something that Sanderson clearly knows how to do really well. But there's a pattern to some of his characters, or some aspects of his characters, that come off as just not believably intelligent. This Mathis thing is one example. Another example has to do with the character Jasnah, or Jasnah, apparently it's Jasnah. And this character is this really cool, really bold, scholarly philosopher princess, and often we see her intelligence in how she thinks, and how she uses her education, and what her life consists of. But there's a chapter in the new Stormlight book, again, no spoilers, but this is actually what prompted me to make the video in the first place. Jasnah is faced with this problem, and she's trying to figure out a solution, and when she thinks, Sanderson's trying to portray her thinking like an academic's thinking. And here's how he writes that. Each idea led to answers that felt wrong. Emotional core theory taught her to look toward what drove participants. What emotions might be causing them to act as they did? Was there an intangible emotional reason that blah 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 blah? And then it continues, assuming competence from her enemy, what was her next step? Perhaps formalist theory. Lay out your premises and try to construct the next logical move. And then she does that, and then it says, this led her to economic theory. It taught her to follow incentives. Were there intangibles to be gained by blah 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 blah? Okay, so again, this bothered me so much. And I had a sense of why, but as I mentioned, my background is not in academia at all. I'm a college dropout, so I wasn't sure if okay, maybe this is how academics talk, maybe there's more to this. So I talked to friends of mine who do have an academic background, and I found it fascinating that they all basically said the same thing. They had almost identical reactions. This led her to economic theory. It taught her to follow incentives. Were there intangibles to be gained by this guy doing blah blah blah?
So you see me shake my head here, right? That doesn't sound anything like anyone would.
That's just not what people do. That's like when you're in high school and you don't really understand it.
Because this isn't just not how an intellectual person would think about it, but it's also the way that a teenager would think about it.
That's exactly what Levi said. He said it sounds like a beginner.
Yeah, she just sounded like a beginner. I mean, this is how a high schooler would talk.
Makes it uniquely unplausible that they would take this very undergraduate approach to the problem.
My friend Terrill said it reminded her of the scene in Legally Blonde.
There's a complete lack of mens rea, which by definition tells us that there can be no crime without a vicious will.
I am aware of the meaning of mens rea.
Squircle just sent me this meme about gravity. So what everyone said as far as why this comes off as so intellectually juvenile, and this is concerning if you're specifically trying to write an academically advanced character, is that if you're making reference to theories by name and you're applying them in this contrived, stilted way, it's a sign that you have not incorporated those ideas into what you see as real. Estee was saying, say you have a jar of cookies, and you come down in the morning and see that everyone ate the cookies. You don't go,
well, I'll use subtraction here
yeah, right.
to figure it out. And now I'll use subtraction and then, I know how many. You just subtract it. You know what I'm saying? Jasnah's trying to understand why people are doing things.
Mm-hmm.
So she could think about what would drive them, what would their benefit be, what would their goal be. It's just like a normal way to think. Right. But if they're trying to say she's using such and such a theory,
mm-hmm.
then it means that she's leaving the realm of considering the actual things and doing some kind of abstract application of something.
Right.
You don't have an underlying reality, but what you do have is things that people have said and facts about it. And so you're just trying to fit things into different patterns that you heard of.
What she's demonstrating by calling out her intellectual maneuvers like she's an anime character calling out attack names is not how learned she is. It's how unintegrated what she studied is into her worldview. Something else that makes this difficult is that the other glaring problem with this is that these theories are not theories. They're barely even ideas. Emotional core theory is that people have emotions. I need a theory for that. But even taking that and putting it aside for a second, even if she was making reference to a theory that was more than incentives exist, she's demonstrated that she has to make reference to these ideas that she doesn't quite understand well enough to build on or to improvise with, or really just work with at all. But the fact that it didn't come off that way to Sanderson when he wrote it, and the fact that he wrote Taravangian in this way that implies that political intelligence can be assessed by a math test, and another fact, which is that when Sanderson talks about writing smart characters, he often brings up a specific example in Ken Jennings, his former roommate, who is the most winningest Jeopardy player ever in history, i.e. someone who is maybe also smart. Memorizing trivia is an accomplishment, it's a skill, and maybe aside from having that skill, he's also a really, really smart guy. But thinking that Jeopardy has anything to do with intelligence is again viewing intelligence as unintegrated. Jeopardy is about knowing useless facts and putting them to use in a useless way. Sanderson also specifically loves to bring up Jennings' mastery when it comes to referencing Simpsons quotes. And again, it's not like it's a bad thing, it is a skill, it is really fun, but it's totally useless, it's totally unintegrated. So what I see emerging from this is that the root of Sanderson's view of intelligence, when it bothers me, is this way that he treats knowledge as separate from reality. And his intelligent characters, who I love by the way, Navani and Dalinar, have knowledge which is very, very integrated into reality. We see Navani developing this whole field of science, really revolutionizing everything from practically nothing, and it's beautifully grounded in what she is doing, what she is understanding about the world. Dalinar does not become wise by reading a book. He can read it over and over again as much as he wants, but he becomes wise by living the wisdom of that book. And with that, let's go back to what I normally talk about on this channel, which is Arcane. And Arcane is the same way, but it's also just hyper aware of this question of integration. And you can see them start taking up the question and playing around with it.
What, you don't have parents?
Kate is a beautiful example of a character witnessing how their education completely fails to integrate into the real world. Like we said in the last video, Kate comes across as someone who's really well educated. She seems like she was probably a really good student, good academically, but then they clearly depict the separation between that and understanding the world she lives in. But an even better example of this is Heimerdinger, who undoubtedly knows a lot of things. He is learned in many facts, but the story makes us doubt his intelligence because it doesn't integrate, because he's completely out of touch. The fact that he doesn't even live by his own principles is used to demonstrate this.
We must hold each other accountable.
And who holds you accountable?
And we also have a scene like this one where Heimerdinger's talking about a scientist he really admires, and it's really telling.
Stanwyck Padidley.
Everything he built either exploded, melted, or toppled over.
Here it almost sounds like he respects it even more because it doesn't integrate. And then once Heimerdinger's kicked out of his ivory tower, how does he actually become smart? By literally physically integrating. And by talking to the real wisest character in the show, in my opinion, someone whose entire education comes from his close proximity to life. And all of Arcane's characters who are actually portrayed as smart are people whose intelligence is conceived of and grappled with and expressed in how it plays out in reality. Whether it gets results, whether it's realistic, i.e. integrated, or unrealistic, unintegrated. And that's why we can't tell if Jace is a visionary genius or like a totally blind blockhead, because so much of his intelligence is not about what's integrating currently, but what he believes will integrate. And we have to kind of see if it does integrate or not. And whenever the story penetrates down to a new, deeper layer of reality, that is coupled with characters demonstrating the impact of real-world experiences they've lived through. That is when we see, I thought you could love me like you used to, but you changed too. And in our pursuit of the great, we fail to do good. And is there anything so undoing as a daughter? And no matter what happened in the past, it's never too late to build something new. And actually, the clearest example of this is something that totally could be portrayed as purely in the realm of philosophy and scientific ethics. The mutation must survive. But Arcane goes out of its way to show that it's only after Victor lives a full life of pain and struggle to protect his own life, only then does he come around to this philosophy of science.
I understand now.
So ideas becoming real to you, life experience leading to a deeper understanding of the world, that is characters being smart. It's using experiences, it's using principles to invent things, to shape the design of things, like websites, web design. That is real intelligence, which is why you should check out Squarespace, the all-in-one web design platform for entrepreneurs. Take it away, IRL Schnee. Hi. So, I'm going to use this ad as an opportunity to ask my viewers a question that I have been curious about. With this wonderful sponsorship opportunity, I've been thinking about the phenomenon of how-to websites. And as an example, I was thinking about something that I know how to do, which is how to be a YouTuber. And I was like, wait, maybe that's something that I should actually make something about. I have a lot of thoughts about that. Maybe my audience would be interested in hearing some of those thoughts. I don't even know what I would do, but let me know if you guys would be interested in something like that. But until then, let me tell you about how Squarespace would be perfect if you have a little gem of knowledge to share with the world. First of all, having your own website gives you the ability to personalize what you're envisioning for your needs specifically. You can upload videos and organize them into different libraries, different courses. If you want to do it for free, you can do that. If you want to monetize, you can put everything behind a paywall. If I had a course I was selling for a topic like this, I'd probably do a donation-based model. Squarespace has built-in tools to do that very easily. People can contribute whatever they want, either one-time or recurring donations. And then right alongside your content, you can offer a variety of services too. I probably have a little thing for paid consultations and have a calendar where people could schedule appointments. Both very, very easy to set up. And probably one of the biggest reasons why people don't build websites is that they feel like, how's anyone ever going to see it? But Squarespace has all your SEO needs covered too. Even if you're someone with zero reach through any social media platforms, anything like that, Squarespace offers really effective SEO tools that are integrated into your website so that you can show up directly in search engine results and people can find you easily. So if you have have something you want to share with the world, and you want your own online platform to do that effectively, go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain using code schnee. Okay, so this is a lot. I want to recap very clearly where we are before we go deeper. What we are looking for here is a specific definition of intelligence that produces flawed expressions of intelligence like Taravangian's math test and Jasnah's theories. And the place where we arrived at before the ad break was not the definition of intelligence itself, but the major premise that that definition of intelligence will rest on, which was a way of viewing knowledge as something which is separate from reality, not necessarily integrated. So the next step of our analysis is going to be figuring out how that view of knowledge versus an integrated view relates to definitions of intelligence. So I want to take two steps here. So the first is to establish some terminology that I thought was very spot on. Listen to Tamar describe this.
I think in terms of like the character being intelligent, she hasn't thought of anything. She just like matched two things.
I think matching is the perfect word for this because like Tamar's saying, it's like this instantaneous this goes with this. And there's really nothing, there's no process in between. The natural question from there is, what do I mean by process? What is happening during this thing that we're calling thinking? I mean, typically we think of thinking as like forging connections, and that is what Jasnah is doing, so what is missing there? This was a line of questioning that came from my friend Levi, pointing out that while this does sound like an amateur, there is an appearance of logic to how linear this thing that we see her doing is. So why isn't thinking like this? When you hear really, really smart people talking, why doesn't it sound like if P then Q, take the formula, apply the formula? On the contrary, it's a lot more like Squircle's meme. When you hear really, really smart people talking, it's not like totally aimless, but it's so much looser, it's so much freer than this if P then Q stuff. It's a lot of jumping around to different parts of an idea or a topic. It's exploratory. There's back and forth, there's questioning, there's considering and throwing stuff out, there's tweaking, there's lots of intuitive weighings of things, there's a lot of like half calling things to mind, like remembering random old ideas or random models or random things you read or discussed, and when conclusions happen, they're not like direct deductions, it's more like they kind of bubble to the surface or they sharpen by talking around them, they kind of emerge like David from a block of marble. So again, it's a good question, why isn't all thinking linear? Why shouldn't all thinking be linear? Isn't it logical to start with axioms and then make deductions? Aren't all these things we learn, all these ideas, aren't they tools to figure out how reality actually works? Why shouldn't thinking just be using our tools? Take theory and apply theory, that should be the whole point. Isn't that exactly the kind of integration I was complaining about the lack of earlier? So here's Levi's idea. The answer is that yes, these ideas and theories and models are tools, but reality is far too complex to take a simple idea like this and just apply it directly to reality. The way it actually works is that we take these ideas and theories and models and we don't use them as tools for building reality. We use them for building these much more complex entities in our minds, namely our worldview, our methodology, and our intuition. And these things are complex enough to engage with the complexity of reality. So when we see people taking some theory they saw in a textbook and applying it directly, if P then Q, that feels juvenile because it's implying that reality is as simple as a textbook, and we all know it's not. But when we see characters whose education, whether in the classroom or in the streets, has provided them with a unique worldview, has given them a way of thinking that can generate new ideas and absorb new information and create new models of reality, has given them a powerful intuition that can adapt to new situations and operate seamlessly, that feels mature. So I think with that we have our Havamina and Maskana, our operational mistaken definition, and our conclusionary better definition. Is intelligence having a lot of knowledge, either integrated or unintegrated, and using that bucket of facts and ideas and theories to match things together really fast and efficiently and logically, like Jasnah's theories, or math problems, or Simpsons quotes? Or is intelligence taking facts and ideas and theories, and using those as tools to build your worldview, to train your methodology of thinking, to develop your intuition, to engage effectively in the world? And to reiterate, both of these definitions can be used to understand how Sanderson writes intelligent characters, with the Havamina applying to expressions of intelligence like Taravangian's math test and Jasnah's theories, among other examples, and the Maskana applying to expressions like Navani's scholarship and Dalinar's wisdom, among other examples. Okay, so the question now, which I'm sure all the writers and creative people want to know, is how do we take these principles and ideas and use them as tools to build our way of thinking, such that we can engage more effectively with the world through our craft of writing? In other words, what do we do with this analysis? Let's say we're writing, let's say we have a character we want to make intelligent. Based on this analysis, where do we start? So I want to consolidate what we've talked about into 4 tools for writers. The first I'm going to call Journey Before Destination. Convenient name. And this has to do specifically with wise characters. Listen to my friend Local here.
I'm kind of against the idea of wisdom being treated as, I guess maybe I'm just coming from my own life, but I've known wise people, and at no point did I listen to them the first time they said the thing. Like,
interesting.
Just because, I don't think a conversation with a wise character should change the protagonist's perspective. I really don't. I typically don't regard dialogue as being, unless you're trying to pull on some underlying energy or dynamic, like you want to say, oh, this scene is this character dominating this other character. People's minds generally don't get changed in arguments. Like, I feel like that's so rare. And so to treat it like, oh, this wise character is going to come with all the wisdom and solve the problem. I don't think when wisdom is treated as information, that is when it's no longer wisdom. Like, oh, I'm having a problem. Oh, great mentor. Like, what is your wisdom? And then the mentor literally tells you how to solve the problem. That is not wisdom. That is just information.
So in Arcane, like we touched on a little bit already, you see this in how Vi doesn't immediately listen to Vander, and how Victor doesn't immediately accept what Sinch tells him, and Heimerdinger doesn't immediately understand where Echo is coming from. They all have to live their lives first, live a full story, and then the wisdom is not just information. It's like a distilling of that whole new conceptual world they now had experience living in. And you can approach the same idea from the other end of the process too. Listen to my friend Daniel.
Having a really intelligent character who can speak to the themes that are being subtly communicated to the reader a bit more directly can make them feel way smarter, way more aware, because in the context of the story, they suddenly feel aware of the story in a way that doesn't necessarily break the third wall, but kind of gives that presence to the reader that like, oh, they're more aware of the greater something happening here. And I think Star Wars writing is a whole thing I could get into. But I think one of the true brilliant things they did execute in terms of that kind of character was Yoda in the original trilogy. Yeah. Let Luke start complaining, you know, oh, I want to go to Tashi Station to get the power. He's that vibe around Yoda. And Yoda comes back. Yeah. Yoda comes back with just like 3 lines. And he'll take that whole conflict, he'll distill it down, and he'll like spell out why Luke is frustrated, why he needs to get over that frustration, and how he can do it. He's again taking that step back in the narrative, looking at like from almost a reader level what Luke is struggling with, and then he'll just say 3 lines. And you as a writer need to be not only aware of your narrative, you need to be aware of the conflict as the reader understands it, and not break the fourth wall necessarily while having another character communicate it and make it believable. That's hard. And that's something that I think Yoda is, like, in terms of pop culture knowledge, one of the best examples of. You know, there's that famous line, do or do not, there is no try.
Yeah.
Out of context, stupid line, but in the context of what Luke is specifically doing, brilliant.
Again, this is about making wisdom feel less like information and more like a worldview. The power isn't in the wise thing being said, it's about how the statement encapsulates this new worldview we're being acquainted with. What we talked about earlier with showing ideas after struggle and conflict also fits into this. It's really not just the idea itself, the idea is representative of that journey, and its relationship to that journey is where the wisdom is really coming from. This is one of my favorite things about the Stormlight Archive in general, that empowerment is so linked to ideas, and those ideas need to be expressed not just as information, but as deeply felt truths, as deeply integrated wisdom. You're not just saying a fact, you're maybe bearing testimony, to borrow a term from Sanderson's tribe. I don't know if I'm using the term like they use it, but it fits broadly. The phenomenon of not just speaking truth like with your mouth, but with your spirit, with your soul. This deep, complex inner part of you that Levi postulated is being built by your ideas. Okay, on to writing tool number 2. Flaws are more interesting than powers. How about that? Again, very convenient. Show your smart characters being wrong, being confused, failing. If you're afraid it's going to compromise the audience's respect for their intelligence, no, on the contrary, just like magical empowerment or really any empowerment, seeing limitations will A, just fascinate your audience, B, it will help them see this thing, the character's intelligence, for what it is and isn't structurally, and C, it will showcase values associated with intelligence. A fantastically illustrative example of this is Sherlock, BBC Sherlock, in social situations. They don't just show him not understanding, it's not just drawing a blank, they show him applying Sherlock thinking to situations where it does not work or help at all. And that clarifies it isolates it in our mind as, oh, this is not just some monolithic superpower of intelligence, it is a way of thinking that operates in these specific ways. He does these things, he's hyper-complex and thorough and ruthless in these ways, and that works in crime solving very efficiently. And it doesn't work in social situations, obviously, clearly doesn't work. Showing it not work lets us see it as less like a power level and more like a hammer, and obviously hammers don't work in some situations. And speaking of Heimers, probably my favorite example of this in all of Arcane, Heimerdinger fails spectacularly in politics, and it gives us the opportunity to see his intelligence really shine. This character is willing to totally humble himself and be ruthlessly intellectually honest in exploring what he had blinded himself to. We see him do this tremendously courageous act of restarting his intellectual journey from scratch, basically. Another example I love is this one with Jinx.
It's all about these runes. They form some kind of mathy, magic-y gateway to the realm of heebie-jeebies.
and then right after that she fails. But again, we get to see it's not just like, oh, it didn't work. We witness for ourselves how her crude, weirdo, undercity, self-taught way of thinking translates the super esoteric area of science into Jinx brain language. And then we see another quality here also. Jinx is not some visionary like Jace out there pioneering a whole new field of science. She may not even have like genius levels of brain power in quotes at all, but what she has is perseverance. Just like she was a kid, she sticks with it, she tries again, she keeps on tinkering and tinkering until it works. With all of Victor's failures, we see that despite the fact that he has a very sharp intellect, he continually fails to turn it inward. With Jace, it's that he's good at figuring out how to do things, but then he just turns off his brain and trusts his intuition blindly. He has almost no deliberate thought at all when it comes to the actual decision making, and like when it comes to being a visionary, that powerful trust in his intuition is his greatest strength, but in politics and fighting and like functioning in society, it's just a disaster. Okay, third writing tool, again, conveniently, expand, don't add. Expand what you already have before you add something new, Sanderson's third law of magic, which applies just as much to magic as does to intelligence and wisdom feeling nuanced and real. We talked about this in my last video with Silco. This is a mastermind type character with this big grand plan and all these people to manipulate. You could give him like 100 different intellectual tools to do that, or
there's a monster inside all of us.
You could give him just that one idea and make him understand it so deeply that he can apply it in every area of his life in every single situation. Again, that makes the character's intelligence feel like it's coming from a worldview instead of discrete ideas like the kind you'd find in a textbook. Hermione Granger is another great example of this in an entirely different way. Hermione researches. That is what she does. She is fairly mediocre when it comes to everything besides being like a super duper amazing student, so any problem for her, it's like the Quailman to the library, where yeah, she is getting discrete textbooky facts there, but there's an implication of a worldview there that values school-type education above everything else.
Before either of you come up with another clever idea to get us killed, or worse, expelled.
Tyrion Lannister has his crafty worldliness type intelligence, and he has to use that in every single situation because someone like him has very few other options.
If I had been born a peasant, they might have left me out in the woods to die. My brother has his sword, and I have my mind. And a mind needs books like a sword needs a whetstone.
Okay, tool number 4 I'm going to call unite them. Show how intelligence is unified with personality. The Sanderson character who activated my pet peeve on this particular point was Ham in Mistborn. The idea of this character is soldier dude who is interested in philosophy, and the knowledge being separate from reality thing that manifested here in a character sense. We had this one aspect of the character that was like very intellectual, and that was just completely unintegrated into his soldier side. You could have just subtracted interest in philosophy from that character and put like anything else in that slot, and the character would not have changed. Even his dialogue honestly wouldn't really change. Like the philosophy parts of his conversations were just totally separate from everything else that was going on. It was like plot focused talk, but what is the meaning of life? Oh, you, Ham and his philosophical questions, plot focused talk. So to be clear, what I want to see here is that when a character is not like saying smart thing or like actively doing a smart, I want to see aspects of their personalities that flow naturally from the type of intelligence they have. And I think a great way to do this is showing what characters value and don't value because of their intelligence. My favorite example in all of Arcane is this.
Ha! What about those over-designed bitch mittens you didn't even build yourself?
Jinx's type of mechanical inventor intelligence really does not like bad design, she doesn't like inefficient design, and she really respects people who make their own stuff. Another example of this is the super brief little Jinx moment. She sees Rictus's little magic-absorbing gems, and we see her face and we can just feel her inventor brain going, ooh, what's that? Oh, what's going on here? So curiosity comes with her type of intelligence, stopping and figuring stuff out, both of which are not necessarily true of all intelligence types. Vi and her street smarts, for example. And speaking of Vi, we can look at a Vi example.
You almost got me killed. My little sister could do that when she was 7.
Because Vi is a character who's all about street smarts, she looks down on Kate's lack of athletic ability. And you look at Singe and he's just full of examples.
The mutation must survive. Love and legacy are the sacrifices we make for progress. Loneliness is often the byproduct of a gifted mind. In my experience, no one in power is innocent.
Since we have this character whose intelligence is so heavily related to a single-minded focus on his plan, everything else is devalued. And to use a non-Arcane example that I love, Katsumoto in The Last Samurai values conversation.
This is a very good conversation.
Even when it's super awkward and hostile and weird, and that's because it flows naturally from his strategic form of intelligence.
And what do you want?
to know my enemy.
And speaking of strategic minds, another really great Sanderson example is Adolin. He is a military officer, and he really values strategy games. He is a big-time gamer, and again, all that comes back to his military intelligence. And to go back to Tyrion for a second.
The Night's Watch protects the realm.
Ah, yes. Against grumpkins and snarks and all the other monsters your wetness warned you about.
Tyrion is a skeptic. He really does not value superstition and myth and folklore. And that is intimately tied with another intellectual value of his.
You're Ned Stark's bastard, aren't you? Did I offend you? Sorry. Let me give you some advice, bastard. Never forget what you are. The rest of the world will not. Wear it like armor.
Tyrion really respects honesty. He doesn't like people beating around the bush. And another last-minute example that I have to include, when I was talking to Dr. Konijnendijk about Ham, he brought up an example of a soldier philosopher, a very well-known one, where we absolutely did see this integration depicted very realistically, because this guy was a real guy, and he happened to even be someone we all know.
You know, if you're a soldier / philosopher, I mean, I wonder if he's based this on Socrates, who famously was, fought in many campaigns. There's a couple of really famous.
I didn't realize that. I didn't know that. Wow, interesting.
Socrates is he's quite renowned actually initially as a fighter. So what happens in Socrates, like it is in philosophical dialogues that it comes out that he has all this military experience. Like it comes up because people talk about it and be like, oh, we remember what you were like when you were out there. And the thing is, what you see is not him going like asking his fellow soldiers like, philosophical questions, but you see how his philosophies, how his personal convictions affect his behavior. So he's known to be somebody who's, you're besieging a city in northern Greece, and winter was really cold, but he just walked around in his tunic. He just stood there for days thinking, staring at the city, not really actually seemingly being affected by the cold and the hunger and all the discomforts of being a besieging force. And people resented him for that because he made them feel like they were inferior. But at the same time, it's an expression of what he is like as a person because of his philosophies, right? He believes that these physical concerns shouldn't affect him so much, right? That there are more important things than worrying about his cold feet. And similarly, in another battle, when the Athenians are routed and he has to flee, but everybody else is running away and throwing away their shield and running for their lives, but he is walking around calmly. And when somebody approaches him, even an enemy, he just kind of throws them a look, and it's like specifically about the look that he throws them, where he's just like, "Oh, you want to try it?" Like it's this real sort of confidence, and it means people leave him alone, and so he survives, and others sort of gather around him, and they find safety in that too. And so his philosophy gives him the confidence and the assurance and the stoic sort of attitude that he needs in order to survive in those situations. Now, that's something you can use in a character. Like instead of having him be sort of overtly philosophical in places where that's kind of really inappropriate, you just have him be a person who has, who practices what they preach, who has internalized certain philosophical ideals.
So after hearing this, when you think about like the story of how Socrates' life ended allegedly, the charges against him and his response, his willingness to drink the poison, you could see those decisions as being very impacted by his military career. I'm not saying that his philosophy was shaped by his life experiences directly, but questions like what is the value of my life and what is my duty in terms of that value to my state, these were topics he had thought about a lot. And it makes it somewhat understandable that he would make these decisions so easily and so confidently. And if you have a character like this, even if there is a big separation or like a big compartmentalization, there's a way of doing that organically that's honestly so close integration at the end of the day, where the final setup may be separate, but it results from direct interaction between these two very different parts.
There's one of these dialogues that opens with him. So he lands in the harbor of Piraeus, and then you have to walk up to the city of Athens, which is about 8 kilometers, right? So it's quite a long way. And like right when he arrives, people start mobbing him, asking him questions about the campaign, and he has this very brief answer. He says, "I don't want to talk about that." And that's something that modern day veterans really relate to when they read these kinds of things. So it's used to try and get them to talk about their experience or to deal with their experience. It's to say, look, 2,500 years ago, here's this famous guy, you already know him, Socrates. He also didn't want to talk about it because there's this understanding that, the experience you went through on these things is something you can't easily share with people who weren't there. And I think that's kind of the way in which they end up being separated, and the way in which Socrates then goes, let's talk about something else. What's been going on here? That's the kind of thing that actually happens in those dialogues. And so I think a character who combines those two things can absolutely exist, but I think there would be more of a separation so more of a work-life balance, if you will.
Okay, so to sum up, our starting point here was the Taravangian math test. which was unsatisfying because it took this trait we see as profoundly complex, almost beyond our ability to fathom, and treated it as this super simplistic, monolithic, one-dimensional thing. It was like measuring the spiritual oneness of the universe in a midichlorian count. Easy enough mistake to make, but what was the premise underlying that kind of mistake? That was the question we asked, and we saw another example of this simplisticness in Jasnah's thought process. There's no thinking, there's just matching. So it was really this plus the math test plus the pedestaling of useless trivia knowledge, and now we can also add to that Ham's interest in philosophy that was totally unintegrated with his character. All this kind of spoke to this operational premise about knowledge, that it's separate from reality in a sense. It's thinking that like a scholar in an ivory tower or in an ebony tower is wise because look at all the studying.
When did Saruman the Wise abandon reason for madness?
So you compare that to a Gandalf whose wisdom is intimately tied with his world, or you compare that to Dalinar who went on a journey and lived his wisdom, or Navani who lived a life of science and we see that in the change she brought about in her world, or you compare to Arcane's intelligent characters and we always see this heavy integration. We see life experience and proximity to life, we see application of knowledge, we see this distillation of wisdom from the struggle and from the growth of these characters through their own stories. And that led us to Levi's model, of ideas not applying directly to life, but ideas being applied to build a worldview, build ways of thinking, build intuition, with those entities being complex enough to contend with the complexity of the world. And then we had 4 tools for putting these ideas into practice in your own writing. Number 1 was journey before destination, show wisdom not integrating at first, and then only integrating once it has the life experience as a foundation to it. Alternatively, craft your whole story around the wisdom your characters come to understand. Both of these will make the ideas of your story not feel like textbook factoids, but like a formulation of a shift in worldview. Number 2 was flaws are more interesting than powers. It was Sanderson's second law of magic, co-opted for writing intelligence. Use instances of characters being wrong, being confused, and failing to define the way of thinking that they're employing, showing its mechanics by showing its limits, and to showcase values associated with their intelligence. We just cannot see things like intellectual honesty, or perseverance, or attachment to truth unless there is a challenge to that. Number 3, expand before you add. And this is Sanderson's third law of magic, co-opted for writing intelligence. Deepen ideas, deepen application of skills, and those will feel more like this big dynamic living construct version of intelligence, and less like the accumulation of facts version of intelligence. Number 4, unite them, integrate intelligence into personality. Show how it impacts the person when they're not actively doing smart, and a great way to explore this is by showing what characters' intelligence makes them value and not value. And we have the incredible example of Socrates living his principles and exhibiting traits like fortitude and confidence as a result of his philosophical foundation, and also the kind of compartmentalization we would see between the different parts of his life. It's difficult to have a conversation about this topic without it feeling incredibly shaped by personal experience with like intelligent people you know and your own values, like as far as what types of intelligence are real and important. As an example, a blind spot that I see in myself and in this video that's shocking to me maybe, or maybe it's not shocking at all, is a lack of any discussion about intelligence that has to do with knowing a lot of things, which like came up a lot of times in conversations that I was having, and I'd just be like, oh right, that. And just that in the academic culture that I come from, it is not valued as much as like inductive reasoning skills and creativity in thinking and quickness and dedication to learning and developing your intuition. And it is important. Obviously, knowing a lot of things is important. And I and a lot of friends of mine, we know we have this blind spot and we fully acknowledge it when it comes up. Knowing things, having a broad knowledge of things, that is something that we should absolutely value more. But even thinking about that, maybe that itself is the difference between Sanderson and Arcane. After all, we have this quote of Sanderson giving a working definition for raw intelligence. And as the final factor, he says,
and a vast store of knowledge to draw upon.
And you compare that to Arcane.
Knowledge is a paradox. The more one understands, the more one realizes the vastness of his ignorance.
Listen here to how Dr. Konijnendijk put it.
But it is pertinent to the question of like, how would you write an intelligent character? Would that be somebody who has the answer to everything, or somebody who is constantly willing to ask more questions and to doubt his own assumptions? Or their own assumptions. I mean, I always feel like, one of the mistakes that you see when you see intelligent characters or characters who are meant to be intelligent is that they go around knowing more than other people. When in fact, I mean, all of the people I know who are really smart are obviously full of doubt, right?
So maybe that is another difference. Maybe it's another tool we can make use of. We can call it journey before destination 2. Instead of demonstrating knowledge that characters do have, show how intelligent they are by what they're willing to question. And anyway, this video is just the very, very beginning of discussion on this topic. There is so much more to explore, but for now we will stop here. Subscribe. What do you think of Brandon Sanderson? Do you have any favorite books? Do you have any favorite things that he does? What do you think of Stormlight 5? If you like the content, support the channel on Patreon. Link is in the description. Thank you so much to Tamar, Estee, Levi, Teacher 4, Dr. Konijnendijk, Squircle, Terrill, Kamiah, Abram, Daniel, Local, and all the other people who discuss discuss these ideas with me. Literally could not have done it without you guys. And huge thank you to Brandon Sanderson as well. Thank you for everything that you've done. Like I said, I have learned a ton from you. Your books are consistently fantastic in so many ways, and you're just a huge inspiration to me. Writing excuses and conversations I had with you at JordanCon were so crucial in starting me on my career path in the storytelling industry, so I hope I did a good job of framing my critique as like a critique of this thing that I didn't like, and a common mindset that writers and anyone can fall into that underlies such a mistake, and doesn't come off as a criticism of like this person of the writer, because I have a lot of respect for this writer. So thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. More Arcane content to come. If you have thoughts on Vi and Kate, leave them in the comments. I am trying to make a video about them. We will see. It's not super coming together right now, but there's some thoughts brewing. Hope you all enjoyed these 2 videos about writing intelligence, and thank you for watching.
Oh, I want to go to Tashi Station and get the power